Hello and welcome to the IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. Today it is a real pleasure to speak with the editorial team of Regional and Federal Studies, one of the leading journals in the field of territorial politics, regionalism and federalism. I'm especially delighted to welcome Davide Vampa, lead editor of the journal and senior lecturer in territorial politics at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, where he also serves as a co-director of the Centre on Constitutional Change and the chair of the ECPR Standing Group on Federalism and Regionalism, as well as Marielle Lopez-Santana, deputy lead editor and associate professor of political science at the Schar School of Policy and Government at the George Mason University in the United States. The journal was established in 1991 as Regional Politics and Policy, an international journal, and it was focusing on regionalism in Western Europe. Then, in 1995, the journal changed its name to Regional and Federal Studies, expanding its focus and scope. So let's speak about it. Let's deep in its DNA, in its editorial process, and let's have a look behind the scenes, as we say. So my first question is about the history. How would you describe the journal's core intellectual mission today based on the history and the development of the journal? And also let's join this question with the second one, and that's how do you see the journal's DNA, something that distinguishes this journal from others?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting us. It's great to talk about our journal. As an editorial team, we joined the journal a bit more than 1 year ago, one year and a half ago. And Regional and Federal Studies is a journal, I would say, with a clear intellectual identity, very important in the field of territorial politics. It began with a strong focus on regionalism and territorial politics and federalism, especially in Europe, I would say. The field has changed, and our editorial team also reflects a bit this change. Today, questions of territorial governance are not only about federal constitutions or regional autonomy. They are also about democracy, party politics, and social movements, identity, public policy, inequality, and probably we'll talk about this during our conversation. And I would say that the core mission of the journal today, and Marielle probably will add more on that, is to understand how territorial organization shapes politics broadly defined. So, as I said, we talk about federalism, decentralization, autonomy, and multi-level governance, which remain central to the journal. But we do not treat them only as constitutional or administrative arrangements. So we are especially interested in their political roots, but also in their political consequences. So when I talk about political consequences, I mean, how do political institutions affect representation, party competition, public policy, and so on? And so territory, I would say, is the key element of the journal. So that's I think what I think is the general scope of regional and federal studies. I don't know if Marielle wants to add on that.
No, I think I pretty much agree with David. And again, I want to thank you for inviting us and being able to talk about the journal. But I think mostly this idea of how is it that we can analyze and better understand how is it that different levels of government interact with each other and how that affects different elements of a polity from the political perspective, from the governance perspective, also talking about the effects on policy and also the effects on actors. I think if we have to think about the DNA, that would be the core of what is it that the journal is interested in exploring. Of course, that comes in many different colors and shapes. As Davide mentioned, we're not only concerned with the fact of federations, but as I tell my undergrads when I'm teaching courses, right? All countries around the world have levels of government, right? It's about how is it that they interact with each other when you're thinking about administrative structures, political structures, fiscal structures. And I think in the journal, we're mostly interested in that.
Territorial politics has expanded significantly as a research field. And once we take the last decade or maybe few years, we can see that. I understand that you are fresh editors, but still, when we reflect that change, was there any significant adjustment worth mentioning? Something that journal had to change or had to adjust in order to cover that particular research division or sort of like trend?
I would say that the scope of the journal has broadened as the field itself also has broadened over the last 30 years or more. As I said earlier, earlier debates were often about classic federal systems, regionalism in Western Europe, institutional decentralization, and these topics remain important. But the journal now also receives and also publishes work on various issues, as I said, territorial inequality, regional parties, nationalism, secessionism, populism and territorial politics, constitutional change, and multi-level governance also in unitary systems, not necessarily in federations. And we also look at not just at the intermediate level between the national and the local, but we also look at the local level. We look also at regionalism on a continental scale, like, for example, the European Union. And there is growing emphasis on other themes, like, for example, not just the center-periphery divide, which is the classic divide discussed in the literature on territorial governance, but also the urban-rural divide, also the tension between successful regions and left-behind regions. And also we are receiving increasing submissions on how geopolitical events shape domestic territorial politics. And the journal has embraced this pluralism. And so I wouldn't describe this evolution as a break from the past, but more as a a process of adaptation. And the journal remains recognizable. We published an editorial last year where we summarized the key aspects of the research agenda of the journal, and there is a key element which is centered on territory, but we expanded the scope and embraced the new developments in the field.
The journal publishes research on a wide range of topics, including federal institutions, decentralization, autonomy, multi-level governance. How do you maintain intellectual coherence across such a diverse thematic scope?
I believe that, as Davide mentioned, right, we explore a wide variety of topics, but I think at the center of the journal, the issue of territory or space, right, if you want to think about it in that way, or multi-level governance is the center of the journal, right? So, for example, many times we get articles that only include subnational governments, but they're not having a conversation with the wider literature, right? So in that way, what I'm trying to say is that when thinking about how is it that we bring coherence to this, is just having this conversation with the question or the topic of federalism, multi-level governance, devolution, decentralization, or even re-centralization. But at the core is this issue of how is it that different levels of government and also how is it that different space might relate to each other, and what are the consequences of that.
And I would add that we don't try to keep coherence by narrowing the journal too much. So we try to maintain coherence by asking whether a manuscript contributes to debates that are recognizably about territorial politics and governance. So, yes.
We know that many journals, they try to get that sort of modern word interdisciplinary. And it attracts scholars, it attracts more articles and submissions. So when it comes to your journal, to what extent does the journal seek to bridge different disciplinary perspectives? And and on the other hand, how do you try to get sort of barriers? So this is our scope. It's wide enough. We have enough submissions, and we want to guard that sort of stream or intellectual stream of thoughts.
I mean, if I can say something on that. So the journal is clearly interdisciplinary, but it has a core, and we had discussions as an editorial team about our identity, because we receive sometimes papers that are purely focusing on economics, for example, or law. So I would say that we are interdisciplinary, but political science is the main reference point of our typical submission. So the core is politics and political science. And of course, we encourage also dialogue with other disciplines like geography, public policy, constitutional studies, sociology, economics, regional studies broadly defined. But political science is the core, and it's important for us because it's also what distinguishes our journal from other journals that have a territorial dimension. But for example, they're more focusing on the economics, on or on the legal aspects. So we embrace interdisciplinarity, but our kind of set core is in political science. I don't know if Marielle wants to add on this.
Yes, I completely agree. However, I will have to say, if we want to flag potential authors, I think also being able to have conversations with other fields, meaning what are the implications of the puzzle, the research question, the findings and the evidence when it comes to political economy or political sociology. I think that as in any journal, right, a capable author that wants to convince the reviewers that the paper is good should be able to also engage in these type of exercises, right? So it's not squarely about what political scientists have said, but also how you can communicate your findings in a broader manner. So, but still, I completely agree with Davide, right? If you look at the editorial board, for the most part, all of us are political scientists, right? And also, if you think about the history of the journal, most of the editors have also been political scientists.
One of the common issues when people and scholars are submitting the papers is they asking, do they want more theory? Do they want more case studies? Do they want me to focus more on case studies? Should I get larger theoretical part? And this sort of balancing is always interesting and as well important, because it depends how the journal editors are going to see the paper, what sort of perspectives I can offer. So regarding these two, where the journal is aligning more? Is it more to the theoretical modeling, or it's more case studies?
When we receive a paper, we are mostly interested in the research question, the evidence that can be theoretical, empirical, or whatever is it that the method the author is using, and the contribution, right? I think that for the most part, given the nature of our field, right, most of the papers are going to be case study specific, right? Most of the papers that we get are looking at one case, going deeper, and that can be quantitatively or qualitatively, right? But in general, we welcome all type of papers, right? If we get a paper that is trying to establish what is the self-rule element of federalism, for example, those type of papers are welcome. But I think mostly the way, at least I tend to think about this as a comparativist, there's a broad range of methods that go from single case to the comparative method to large N. And that's the way I see the journal, right? The journal is truly a comparativist type of journal that can be a case study specific, right? Because we want to understand, for example, how is it that a federation it has been changing, right? So you might get these papers that are very in-depth, right? While you might also get papers that are trying to establish a regularity in the behavior or the outcomes associated to federalism, right? Just for example, right? So we are not, we don't filter the papers in any way. We're mostly interested in the contribution that they have to make.
I would add that I totally agree with what Marilia said, and we strongly value empirical work, and including single case studies. I think the key question is always what the case helps us understand beyond itself. Single case studies, if they are grounded in general theories, if they are theoretically informed, can be very helpful. And of course, we also have studied that a theory building, maybe they start from a case study and they build a theory based on that, which, however, needs to go to speak to a wider audience. So even single case studies, we encourage our authors to speak to the wider audience, because there might be readers who are not specifically interested in that case, but they are interested in some dynamics, mechanisms that are important in that case, but might be important also for other cases. So even single case studies can be intrinsically comparative.
When we look at submissions, and again, let's go to the past, do you see any emerging field or topic that is just going, it's prevailing over others? That's the first question. And second question, the journal has a simple name, Regionalism, Federalism, like 2 words. But do you think that the journal's mission is understood equally when we go to Asia, Africa, Europe, Northern America, or people see differences? Because sometimes this is my case. I speak about something that for me it's clear, but maybe for other scholars, that's sort of, there is maybe different approach or different perspective of understanding.
In terms of trends, I think it's not that they're really dominating what we're getting, but we do see some emerging topics, right? One is, how is it that the issue of democratic backsliding, or if you want to call it authoritarian regimes in some instances, like Russia, for example, how is it that it has affected the division between different levels of governments and also the dynamics that go with that, right? So I think that's a clear trend that we see in some of the papers that we're getting, right? Because of course, this is a relevant question for many of us, including, for example, issues of populism at the regional level, issues of different types of political parties, more to the radical right at the national and subnational level. So certainly we see that. And in the case, for example, in the case of Russia, how is it whether subnational levels are still relevant, right? What is happening at the subnational level given trends towards recentralization? Another one is the issue of how is it that different types of critical junctures or emergencies have affected federalism or multi-level governance. So for example, how is it that the pandemic affected the division of competencies between levels of government? How is it that the financial crisis, for example, affected that division of government and the actors? So in that way, also, for example, when we're talking about resilience and climate change, also we have seen some papers on that. So for example, how is it that subnational levels are handling those type of pressures? So those are some of the topics that we increasingly see. I will leave the floor to Davide so he can add to that.
I think Marieli, you covered most of the more recent developments in our submission. Definitely the issue of populism, the issue of democratic backsliding, the issue of how to deal with crisis. I would also add, for example, the climate change and climate-related governance that's becoming very important. In my experience, the concepts of regionalism and federalism travel quite widely, and I didn't experience any issue with scholars from other regions of the world misunderstanding the scope of the journal in that respect. Sometimes there is let's say more a kind of disciplinary misunderstanding. There are some papers that are very legalistic or very much focused on the economics, and they don't have anything on the politics. So that's perhaps that's the main issue maybe we have sometimes with scholars from other regions of the world. But in terms of the general concepts, I think these are quite clear, I hope, also given the fact that the journal has existed for so long. So I think, it's a dynamic field, as Marieli has said, but it's very much grounded in concepts that are well established, I would say.
Are there any topics, themes that you would like to see more submissions on?
Well, I would say that some topics were mentioned by Marieli, and these are the things that are becoming more and more relevant. So populism and the territorial dimension of populism, and also how territorial dimension of democratic backsliding. There is a lot of literature on what happens at the national level, let's say, but a bit less about what's happening at the subnational level, and this is growing, and we would like to receive more publications in that field. And when we talk about territorial politics, as I said, an increasing emphasis has been placed on the tension between urban and rural areas. And we see also an increasing contributions in that field, but I think that subfield is growing. And also, we live in an era of perma crisis, poly crisis. So it's increasingly interesting to see how multi-level governance system address these challenges, these multiple crises. So,
in terms of the regional perspective, as the person who is responsible for the Americas, we don't get as many submissions, especially when it comes from the US. So from my perspective, I would like to see more papers from the US or about the US that have a conversation with other regions of the world, right? I think in part, being the US, it is because federalism and American politics has really dominated that niche, right? But I really would like to welcome different type of conversations about how is it that we can think, for example, about democratic backsliding in the United States in relation to European cases or in Latin American cases, right? So those certainly will be the type of papers that I would like to see. And also, more from the methodological perspective, as we're saying, most of the papers that we get are case studies, include perhaps 2 or 3 cases, but large N papers, I would like to see more of those, so we can kind of push the field forward, thinking about whether we can think about some regularities in terms of different type of dependent and independent variables.
I think there is a logical extension to what you just said, and that's the next question about qualitative and quantitative methods, and also mixed research methods. So how does the journal approach the methodology, the methods? And is there any clear alignment, or is it sort of like balance between the three?
We can agree that our approach is pluralist, so we don't privilege one method in the abstract. So for us, and I think Marielle and I agree, a good article is one where the research design fits the question. I think that's the main thing. Of course, some questions require deep historical or institutional knowledge, and so they're more qualitative and based on one case or 2 cases. Others benefit from large N comparison or survey data, text analysis of national datasets, and as Marielle said, we are seeing an increase in quantitative methods in articles that are based on quantitative methods. And indeed, our editorial team is also adjusting to that. But we encourage people also using large data sets to submit their papers. But of course, the key element is the question, because you can have a very sophisticated methodology, but if the question is banal or is, quite obvious, then I don't think that the methodology should drive the paper, but the other way around. It's the question that should drive the methodology in some ways. And of course, we also encourage mixed methods. We have also papers that have a section that is quantitative, that shows a kind of general pattern, and then maybe a focus on 1 or 2 cases to explore the mechanisms. But
Is there the most popular research method? Because when we say qualitative, quantitative, or research mixed methods, scholars would say, and what does it mean? So is there anything which you would like to highlight as a method that it's like the most common, or the method that is the most used by the scholar? Or it might be also a emerging method that is coming up from the background and it's getting more and more on the horizon.
I don't think we have a method that dominates, right? There are certain type of research questions that tend to be associated with different type of methods, and in part that is shaped by the data, right? So as the field has really tried to go subnational, given this subnational research tradition, you might see that some authors are bringing that type of data, right? So therefore, you might see more quantitative type of papers, right? However, as Davide mentioned, right, there's a balance in terms of the submissions that we get, but as I noted, I think it's mostly based on type of research question and also what type of data are available, right? I think that I would like to see more of those papers that really try to explore the subnational research tradition and can bring in new type of data, because that is very innovative. For example, if we refer to the Regional Autonomy Index, we understand the type of impact that type of data can have. So we will welcome those type of submissions. Of course, it depends on many different factors, whether it gets accepted or not. But I think we are open to any of those type of methods.
And when we speak about that you would like to have more sort of data-driven research papers, are there any obstacles or barriers that scholars might be complaining that, sorry, we can't do this because of this and that? or it's just basically the trend, the research design that the scholars are working with?
Sometimes there might be limitations in the availability of data. In general, I would be cautious about saying that the journal wants a specific method, and indeed there are barriers, constraints, and availability of data. There are countries that have very advanced data sets, and so it's easier in those contexts to run large N analysis at a subnational level, because of course there is also the challenge of finding data at a subnational level. And if you are comparing different countries, also the comparability of subnational data is a big challenge when you're looking, I don't know, at regional budgets, or you're looking at also aspects of regional politics. So we don't have a kind of preferred methodology in the journal, and we are cautious to advise people only to rely on quantitative methods, because we are very much aware of the limitations. And if I can add also about the recent trends, I see in submissions there is one key innovation methodological is the increasing reliance on experiments, for example. This is also something that is becoming more widely used, and some papers are very interesting and innovative in that respect. But again, it's not, I don't want to say that we would like to see more experimental design in our papers. It's just part of the plurality of methodological approaches that we encounter as editors of the journal.
Yeah, and also my intention is not that now you will have 600 papers with N data scope, because I said this on the podcast. Yeah, so this is just to direct people that what sort of variety of methods the journal accepts, and maybe there are methods which are more and less popular. So therefore we're speaking about it. But that definitely this is not the goal that now all the people are going to do the quantitative and they will neglect the empirical case studies. So just to clarify that. Let's speak about the editorial process a little bit. And the first most common question, what are the most common problems, issues, or mistakes that you encounter in manuscript submissions? And now let's speak about something except the AI, because AI will go as a second question.
And I will start probably Marilee also from her experience. She has additional things to say, because also each of us as editor of the team has had different issues, of course, when you assess manuscripts. So first of all, there are some manuscripts which don't make the contribution clear enough. They may be interesting. The general topic might be interesting, but the reader is left wondering what debate the paper is speaking to, what we can learn from that paper, and which we didn't know before. And sometimes that's an issue. Then some papers are too descriptive. And they provide a rich account of the case, but they do not sufficiently connect the paper to key concepts. And these are also, they are not theory based. On the other hand, some papers are very well positioned in the literature, but they are empirically very poor. Or some papers are not well positioned in the literature. And sometimes I also had cases in which there was a mismatch between the question, the evidence, the conclusion, so also the kind of coherence of the paper. Maybe there are also other issues that are regard the style and so on. Maybe Marieli can also say something on that.
No, I have to agree with Davide, right? In terms of, for example, when it comes to desk rejects, often what we see is papers that are about cases that are in a federation, for example, or in a very decentralized setting. However, these papers are not having a conversation with the literature on multi-level governance, federalism, depending on how is it that you want to frame the paper, right? So you have these subnational levels that are the main topic under consideration, but however, there's no conversation in terms of what is going to be the contribution to the literature. That I see very often on my side. Another one is once you go over the revision process, pay very close attention to what the editor and the reviewers are telling you, right? That can be complicated because you might have reviewers that have different views. However, in general, I think the editor generally steps in and will give some guidance in terms of saying, well, you should pay attention to this part of the feedback in order to revise the paper. Oftentimes you see papers that the reviewers and the editors have said something very clear in terms of how is it that the paper needs to be revised, and the authors do not address those elements, right? So that would be a rejection after a revise and resubmit. Also, I have seen many papers lately in talking about data, that's the point that I was making earlier. They have this wonderful data on subnational levels, and they're trying to fit a debate that doesn't go with the data, right? So the paper is mostly grounded on the data. However, it's not having, in an effective manner, it's not having a conversation with a debate. So the question, the evidence do not match, as Davide have said, right? So you might have different versions of that taking place.
Are there any particular mistakes regarding the early career researchers? Something that goes to that category of scholars, postdocs, some people in PhD programs, and you would like to highlight, maybe there is something you would like to say about it.
I would say, first of all, become very familiar with the process of what it means to write a peer review paper, especially in some cases in which perhaps in the region where you come from, those conventions are not as salient, right? So what it means to write and publish a paper for a journal that is peer review mostly, and, not to use this type of language, but of course, we are mostly based in the North, but also have some people that come from the global South, right? So what are the conventions? Talk to your professors about what it means to write a paper that can be peer reviewed, right? And oftentimes it might seem surprising, but even I get some emails of, why is it that the paper has been that's rejected? Well, because it has to go through a process of peer review and you're not meeting these minimum standards, right? So it is important that from the get-go, the students or the early researchers are familiar with the conventions of what it means to publish in this type of journals, right? I'm also, I'm one to think, and perhaps Davide will disagree with me here, but once you are over that threshold, I do believe that any author should have the opportunity to go through the peer review process, right? Because that's how we grow as researchers, as scholars. So perhaps it's not a fantastic paper, but even if the paper gets rejected, you will get feedback, right? So to understand that rejection is part of the process, and sometimes putting the paper through the journal is an opportunity to get really good feedback to make it better. That's something that scholars should think about. However, on the other hand, you have to be very conscious that if you really want to publish in that journal, you need to go through that threshold, because otherwise you will lose that opportunity with that paper, right? So you need to be strategic in that way, right? You want to get the feedback, but you need to make the paper solid enough that it goes through the process of not getting this rejected. So how do you play with that? That is an important element when it comes to kind of the feedback that I can provide to these early researchers or scholars.
I totally agree with what Marily said. And as editors, we also try to play an active role. So we don't just even when we desk reject papers, at least what I do, but I know that also Marily does that. We try to provide some feedback, some justification for the rejection, something that can help not just early career researchers, because we also desk reject papers by more senior people, but I think the editor can provide helpful feedback and should provide helpful feedback. If I can also add another thing about early career researchers, and we really encourage early career researchers to submit their work to our journal, because often it's also quite nice to see rising stars that start from an article in our journal and then move on to even bigger journals and becoming even more established. So it's nice to host, I would say rising stars or emerging scholars. But sometimes a problem that early career researchers have, I noticed, is that they try to do too much in one article. They might have excellent ideas, but sometimes they try to put too much into one article. And the key for a journal article is that it needs to be clear and it needs to have a core argument. It cannot do everything, and often this issue is derives from the fact that basically sometimes the early career researcher takes the article from a chapter of the thesis, which might be a bit denser, or the thesis can afford more background and detail, whereas an article needs to be sharper. It needs to have a sharper framing, a clearer stakes, should be self-sufficient, self-contained, and should have a more direct contribution. So a suggestion for early career scholars, if you are taking a chapter and transforming that into an article, I know that now there is an increasing number of theses that are article-based, so that maybe facilitates this, but there are still theses that are a book that have book chapters. Basically, they are chapters. In that case, you need to work a bit more. It's not just about cutting the words. Sometimes it's also about making the whole argument more direct, sharper, and more effective.
I agree, and always when I speak with scholars, I always say that in my case, in particular, I write on a paper, on a real paper, what I want to research, what sort of article I want to do, and then I try to get 1/3 of it. And this 1/3 serves me for the article, and this is how I recycle what's more important, what's less important. And as you said, we are young, we sometimes want to be clever, we want to show you that I am a clever one, I can work with many concepts, methods, data and everything. But as you said, sometimes it goes contradictory, sometimes it's less is much better strategy in submitting a paper. Let's speak about your favorite topic, AI. How do you approach, what sort of issues are you having, and generally, what AI means for the journal?
Well, I can go first, and I'm sure Marieli also has a lot to say on that, because it's an issue that we discuss as editorial team, and there are some general guidelines from the publisher, but of course they are very general, and usually journals are have the kind of autonomy to decide how to address that issue. We had instances in which, I mean, it's difficult to prove that an article has been generated by AI, but there were cases in which, for example, references were not. I mean, personally, I often check the reference list because that's sometimes the obvious way to check whether the article has been AI generated. And although, I mean, and there were cases of papers that were desk rejected because of that, and this is quite bad because it means that they also didn't even check the references. Even if you use AI, maybe you check the references. Personally, I think that AI is not just an enemy. It's not something that we should avoid. I mean, forbid. And I noticed that there is an improvement in the language, and it can help with the kind of the style and the quality of the prose and so on. But of course, the content, the research should be done by the researcher. So if AI is used to refine, to improve the language, also to improve the visualizations, that's totally fine, I would say. Maybe Marieli disagrees with that, but if we delegate too much to AI, then we risk really undermining the not just the quality of the research, but also, there are ethical issues, which, as a team we discussed. We don't have a kind of specific policy at the journal level. We rely on the publisher level policy, which is quite general. Probably we will have to develop more precise guidelines in the future.
I completely agree with Davide there. I think that in the classroom, as journal editors, all of us are struggling with how to handle these questions. I wish that especially publishing houses will have better technology to allow us to detect these different type of instances. Sometimes we just mostly have to go with the hunch, right? And some good practices like checking the references. But what we typically ask the authors is just to be very transparent and disclose the use of AI when they're submitting the article. That's as far as we can go, right? Given the limited tools that we have. But I think, having conversations from the classroom and also with editors everywhere, I think all of us are in the same boat in terms of how is that we are going to handle these type of challenges. And there's not still good guidance on how to do that.
Peer review process is often criticized for being slow and inconsistent. Many scholars are asking so many questions. Are there any practices that you implement to make this process fair and efficient? And the second question, since you became the editors of the journal, did you implement any changes that were required? Or are you continuing with what was established before?
Yes, when we formed the editorial team, we initially decided to lower the number of days in order to get a response from the reviewers. Right now, I think it's 2 weeks, right, Davide? I can...
4 weeks. It used to be 6 and now it's 4.
No, I mean to get a response once you send an invitation.
Yes,
You send an invitation, you have 2 weeks to respond. Before it was a little bit longer than that, so we changed that. Also, as Davide mentioned, once the paper goes out, also we reduce the number of days to be able to get a response or the review back from the reviewer. In general, I think these different type of initiatives have really worked. We recently saw the data and the numbers of days. We have reduced the number of days in terms of how long it gets to get a response for the author. Right now, Davide can perhaps give you more details about it, but we have decreased the number of days, as I've noted. Beyond that, once the paper, if it gets revised and resubmit, we more or less follow the same procedure. So I think generally papers are out in about, of course, it depends how long it takes for the author to revise, but it can be about 3 months, generally or so for the first round, right? And then ultimately, until it gets published, it depends on many factors, right?
The changes that we introduced that Marily mentioned really helped. Of course, we also acknowledge the fact that we are all under pressure, and peer review is under pressure everywhere. We usually try to secure 3 reviewers, and that's, of course, challenging. And it's particularly challenging, I have to say, unfortunately, with papers focusing on the global south. We, particularly from Asia, we really struggle to recruit, even though we are receiving a lot of manuscripts from that part of the world. There are fewer people who are happy to review. So this is a challenge. We have seen a big improvement. So over the last year, we have seen a doubling in the number of submissions to our journal. So our journal is becoming more visible, and we are getting a lot of submissions. But despite that, because we try also to coordinate, we also meet regularly. We also have updates. Also, as editor and lead editor, we try to do a first screening of the manuscript. So we also have, unfortunately, desk rejects. And because of all this, as Marily said, our decision, so the time for the first decision has been reduced by 30 days. So it used to be 90-something days. Now the average time is around 63 days. So actually it's slightly more than 2 months post-review. I would say that's quite good. This is also because we have more desk reject, of course, that impact on the average. But so despite this massive increase in submissions, because of the coordination, because of also the reduction, and because we give less time to the reviewers to deliver their review, although many of them are late, and we totally understand that we are under pressure and so on, but that has really had an impact, positive impact.
Also, for the most part, the editorial board, each one of us concentrates on a region, and we have recently grown in terms of numbers. So therefore, that allows also to be more efficient in terms of how we handle each one of the manuscripts.
What does editorial board mean for the journal, and who can be there? Because we know some journals, they have like 65 names, some they have 15, 20 names. So what's your approach?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we are now at a stage in which we have consolidated our review process. I mean, as I said, we are a relatively recent editorial team. So we inherited the editorial board. We added a few people, including the previous editors. But yeah, our aim is to have a stronger dialogue with the advisory board. They already help us to identify, for example, often we have issues identifying reviewers. So they play an important role in that sense. But We would like to involve them more. We don't have 65 people in our editorial board. I don't remember exactly how many we have, but it's a good, decent size. And of course, because of the size, it's difficult to coordinate with all of them, but we are trying also to organize this year a forum involving the editorial board, and we usually communicate with them periodically by email, telling them what's happening in the journal, if we appoint new editors, if they have suggestions about appointment of new editors. When we published our editorial last year, we asked for feedback from them. We received feedback from some members of the advisory board. We also know that they are busy, so they want to be involved, but perhaps they don't want to be involved too much because we are all busy. So we have to find a balance between, we should make sure that they are not just there in a list of names, but at the same time, we don't want to overwhelm them and also I think our task as the editorial team, as the smaller editorial team, is to lead the kind of research agenda of the journal, and the editorial board is there to advise, to suggest, and get to intervene also, if they want. So they don't have to be always involved in everything. That's my view.
And in addition to that, the editorial board allows us to select the prize that we have for the best paper. So they are the ones who vote every year when selecting the winner, or sometimes we have a few people who are involved in them.
There are underrepresented scholars, regions, and sometimes difficult cases. And when I speak with those people, many times they have prejudices to submit the paper in the Western journals, because they usually say this is for established scholars, people who know each other, and similar narratives. How is the approach of the journal to this category of scholars and regions?
I think the first step we took, and I have to thank Davide for doing that, is our editorial board is composed of people in different parts of the world. So, for example, we have an editor who handles the papers on Africa, right? And he is based there, right? So that, of course, is a way to facilitate the communication, but also hopefully make the process more welcoming to people in the global south, right? The same, it can be said about other members of the editorial board. They might not be located in that part of the world, but they are in conversation or are experts on that part of the world, right? So, for example, we have experts on China, experts on the United States and Latin America. So that's one element. From my perspective, also, as the person who is responsible for Latin America, it's true that I'm based in the United States, but originally I'm from Puerto Rico. So I do have the language capacity to be able to communicate with those authors. And for example, recently a paper on one place in Latin America, right? I can have that type of conversation. Once we knew that the paper was going to get accepted, then I can play a more active role in terms of giving them language feedback, feedback in terms of how to make the paper better. So that was, for example, a very productive type of relationship once the reviewers established that the paper was ready to go, right? So I think having those type of skills allow us to hopefully be able to communicate more effectively. I know that's the type of feedback that I have gotten in those type of instances, right? But of course, we can always do better, right? As probably Davide is going to emphasize this, we have seen already that there has been a shift in terms of the number of manuscripts that have been submitted from the Global South. And I think in part, of course, that's a legacy of the previous board. We also had experts in different parts of the Global South. But by us pushing that further, I think that has allowed us to open an opportunity in terms of different type of authors from different places being able to submit to our journal. And if you see, for example, the papers that recently have been published, for example, many of them are on Africa, right? So I hopefully that's a reflection of the type of work that we have been doing as a board.
What Marty said really shows what we have tried to do. And I think since the start, we tried to build the editorial team in a way that allowed us to speak to different audiences in different regions of the world, and having editors who are either experts or are based in the countries, we can really see that this is having an impact. I mean, Marilee mentioned Africa. That's really a case in which we have one of our editors, Asefa Fizea, is based in Ethiopia. And we saw a big increase in manuscripts from Africa, a lot from Nigeria, Ethiopia, of course, being and South Africa. I mean, probably the most prominent countries in that part of the world, but also from other countries in Africa. And yes, this is reflected in our publications. I mean, from the start of this year so far, actually, only 1/5 of our publication is focuses on Europe. I mean, on Western Europe. The rest is mainly Asia. So we have seen also an increase in articles focusing on Asia with authors from that global region. And indeed, we needed to appoint a second editor for that region because we have seen a massive increase there. And then, we have an equal number of articles focusing on Europe, on Western Europe and Africa. And even 2 articles from Russia. Of course, if you look at the kind of bridge between Europe and Asia. And actually, so far, as Marilee said, probably our weakest point in terms of submissions are the Americas, in part in the US because of the strong kind of tradition there, and there are also other journals that appeal to that type of audience, but also from Latin America. But also even there, we are seeing something. So I think that that we are seeing a rebalancing. Definitely, Regional and Federal Studies is a very different journal from the journal of 10, 15 years ago, which was very much a European journal.
A notorious question with yes and no answer. Do you encourage authors to name potential reviewers when submitting a paper?
No.
Okay, the last question for today's interview. What's your strategic priorities and some sort of outlook for the journal for the next years, and something really important you want to implement?
Well, I would say our priority, of course, is to preserve the journal's core identity, as I said, but also make sure that it remains open to where the field is going. So we need to be dynamic. We shouldn't just stick to the familiar topics. And we tried to encourage this, as I said, in an editorial that we published last year as we started as a new team. And we are also encouraging, so our strategy is also to encourage research on newer questions. For example, I didn't mention it perhaps, but also territorial inequality is an important issue. But also, as I said, climate governance, democratic resilience, plurinationalism, social movements and parties, conflicts, but also governance beyond the classic cases. So a lot of innovation and new questions. And also what we are trying to do, our strategy is to strengthen the journal's role as a platform for wider debates. So we want to go also beyond academia. And this is also why with the journal, we also launched a blog. So we encourage our authors to publish blog pieces based on their articles in a way that is accessible to a wider audience. And the blog, I mean, we started the blog a few months ago, and we already have, I think, 17 pieces there. So the idea is not just to publish blogs that are linked to the articles, but also to encourage people to respond to articles with another blog. So to have a journal that is not just published articles, but it's more dynamic, it's more embedded in the general conversation. And again, we see that this is a good strategy in terms of the visibility of the journal. We saw already last year an increase of 30% in our readership. In terms of downloads, this year we are seeing not a further 35% increase. We saw a doubling in submissions, so it's a virtuous circle, I think. So being engaged also on social media, I think we shouldn't be snobbish, and I think this is producing results. Marilee, do you want to add anything on this?
I will have to say that I completely agree there with Davide, in the sense that I hope that scholars who want to innovate in this field really consider us as a journal to go, right? We would like to see those papers that really push the boundaries and within federalism, territorial politics, and so forth. And I think one way that we're trying to do that is by trying to make the journal as accessible as possible through using social media, by trying to incorporate scholars from different parts of the world, etc., etc. So.
Dr. Vampa and Dr. Lopez-Santana, many thanks for sharing your research insights, your editorial process and work insights with us. It's always valuable to know how the journal works, and it's also the human approach to know editors, their work, expectations, and also get familiar with the most common mistakes. Again, many thanks for being on the IR Thinker.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.